Hi everyone, welcome to Perception is Reality, Branding and You. My name is Meredith. It is currently 8:30 where I am in Australia. I am going to be sitting in the chat, hopefully responding to all your questions. We have a lot to get through, so we're going to power through it in half an hour. So hopefully we can have a bit of a chat in the comments of this talk, and I hope it's really helpful. Before I give this talk today, even though I'm doing it virtually, I want to cover a few things that I feel I need to say. This talk was prepared on the lands of the people of the Kulin Nations, of which I want to acknowledge before starting this talk. I want to pay my respects to their elders, past and present. Sovereignty was never ceded. I also want to say that Black Lives Matter is an issue around the world, not just in America, and it is the responsibility of myself and others like me to undo some of the harmful structures we have upheld. I hope everyone is taking time to listen, learn, and support. I also want to acknowledge that the knowledge in this talk, the advice, it's all coming from a very Western and white perspective. My knowledge isn't fully representative. It doesn't necessarily comment to everything, especially cultural contexts around the world. And I strongly encourage you to follow the work of marketers and developers from all around the world to gain further perspective on these topics. All that said, I'm extremely grateful to have been invited to speak and to be chatting to you all today. And I really hope one day we get the chance to catch up in person. So who the hell am I? My name is Meredith. I'm a producer and a marketer. And my current role, and there's me above me, is as Games and Digital Content Officer at Film Victoria. So what the hell is Film Victoria, some of you might be asking? So we are a government state authority which supports local independent screen content. So that includes film and TV as well, but I specifically work in the game space. And we provide production funding and marketing funding to developers locally. So all the games you see here are actually Film Victoria supported games. And my role is to assess grant materials, provide advice, support, connections for our devs, and understand and recognize industry trends and changes, and work through the grant process with our developers. And you might not have heard of Film Victoria itself, but I suspect you might recognize some of these released and upcoming games. Outside of my day job, in my spare time, I'm doing air quotes here, spare time. I keep disappearing and reappearing. It's fun. I'm the communications director and producer for Aconite, which is a San Francisco-based mixed reality company. And we're working on our upcoming title, Hollow Vista. I'm also co-founder of an Australia and New Zealand initiative aimed at supporting disabled developers in games called Accessibility Unlocked. And so I've been in independent development for about 4 years now. So depending on who you speak to, I'm either a tiny baby or a seasoned professional. My focus specifically is on marketing, biz dev, production, comms. And before I was in the games industry, I was actually in print and digital advertising, and comms was what I did my degree in. But the long story short is I've talked to hundreds of developers and marketers and publishers and industry veterans from all over the world in my time in games. And I also managed to get Elijah Wood, aka Frodo, to retweet our announcement tweet. So I think I'm about ready to retire. So let's talk about branding. So what people perceive your brand to be, or your studio or your game, is going to inform their expectations of you. So how much leeway they give you for mistakes, and it lets them confirm or deny their hypotheses about you as a creator. If you set the wrong expectations, their perception of you is going to be negative when you don't meet those expectations. If they perceive you as good and kind from the things you say and do, they might decide to defend you from trolls and become champions of your community. Today, we're going to be speaking about one specific teeny part of your branding, which is your game's pitch. My aim today is to get you to think about how the language you use to communicate your game to your audience creates your brand. Branding is all about communicating value, converting your internal value to an external understanding. So we're not going to cover target audience and how to speak to press and all those details. Branding is one pillar of marketing, but this is stuff that's applicable for every project you're going to make and release, and especially your studio. And some of you might be sitting there being like, I'm a freelancer, this actually doesn't apply to me. But you have a personal brand too. People make judgments on one another based on the external perception of what we hear, what you say, who you work with, how you communicate. Your personal brand is never going to match perfectly with your intentions, but the more authentic you are as an individual or as a brand, the more likely you are to find like-minded collaborators and audience. There's a great article by Liam Esler, the director of Summerfall Studios, on personal branding if you're not quite sure how to tackle it. So all games branding is created entirely in the space and relationship between those internal intentions and materials of your project and team, like your design docs and your team's diversity, and the external understanding and communications of your project and team. You're not always going to share all these materials you see here with your audience, but they'll help guide you as to what you do share, who you're talking to, and why you're talking to them. Similarly, when you know your internal brand, it helps you shape the way you communicate your external materials. Silence can be just as loud as noise, so you need to know where you stand as an organization. A company that releases one game in a niche like VR and spends a year or two building an audience and a brand in this space and then decides to make a free-to-play match game are going to have a much harder time converting their audience and communicating that shift. The way you communicate to a VR audience and the kind of brand you need is very different. And because the internal goals have shifted, this has a flow on to the external. So this is part of what you need to consider early before you're building your first game. What kind of studio are you? What sort of games do you make? Who's your key audience? There's an example that I love by Chris Sikowski, who writes a lot of materials and information around marketing. And I've put his handle there. He talks about how indies complain that people won't spend $5 on their game, but they'll buy a Starbucks coffee. But what you're failing to realize is when you walk into Starbucks and you hand over $5, right? You know what you're getting. You're going to get a coffee of a certain quality level, and you know you'll wait a couple of minutes. All your expectations are set by their brand. If you parked outside in a coffee van as a totally new brand, and you might be selling the exact same thing, exact same quality, but you're not going to get any customers. It doesn't matter that you know your coffee is good internally. You're an unknown quantity. All the other person knows right now is that you sell coffee. They don't know if it's good or if it'll be hot or if it'll be a pleasant sales experience. They have no associations with you because you haven't done anything other than appear. But if you would offer a free coffee or give them a really pleasant experience interacting with you, make it really personal, you might just gain a customer of a Starbucks, but you have to know what you're selling, what's valuable about it, and have something unique to pull them in. And that's all branding and how you communicate that branding. So, we're going to workshop an internal book, a brand book, that's going to inform our external communications and should be considered and revisited as often as design pillars. It might seem like a lot of work to create a document like this, but it is fundamental and integral to your game's success. If you're a worldwide phenomenon overnight, knowing how to talk to different parts of your audience and what matters to them is invaluable, and you want your entire team to be equipped to do so and setting the same expectations across the board. So the first thing you're going to decide on is a name, and this is actually the easiest part to get wrong. This is your unique identifier, the first starting place for an audience to engage with. It has to be short, sharp, memorable, recognizable, easy to spell. Your name sets expectations for your brand, which you then match with all your other materials, and this goes for your studio and your game. If the materials don't speak to each other, you're going to create a dissonance with your audience. So there are the obvious things. You don't want to create a product where another studio already has the name. You don't want to name it after a game that's already released. If you're naming a studio, some people get around this by adding games or interactive. But if your studio name is Puppy Dog Interactive, if someone Googles that, they're going to get a bunch of interactive dog toys. Don't be afraid to forego the perfect name for one that isn't going to cause you problems in the future. Plan for scale. Check all your social media options, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok. Can you get the same handle on every platform? If you're suddenly a global phenomenon, you don't want to cough up 10K to someone on the other side of the world, for a username or on a platform down the track. Find them and reserve them, even if you're not going to use them all. Consider your business structure before you pick a studio name and your game structure before you pick a game name. Sometimes in different places, there are strict rules on how you present your name due to legal reasons. So you want to make sure you're doing the right thing by your structure. You might need to speak to a lawyer, and if you can't afford one, try and reach out to support from small business in your area. They might be able to tell you without it costing you anything, and this covers things like trademarks and copyrights that you need to be thinking about. Connotations and themes is a big one. You want the name to elicit thoughts that are related to your game. For example, Yes, Your Grace, which was published by No More Robots, elicits a few connotations without even an image that give you information. Yes, Your Grace. This is likely a game about medieval times, as this was a common phrase then. It sounds like someone is reporting to or responding to someone, and there's an element of authority and deference. You already know 3 things about this game just from the name alone that when you then look at the materials and read more about it are confirmed, and then you have the experience itself. So, say your game's name out loud. Can it be mistaken for something else? Think about those whisper games you played as a kid, where by the end, the thing being said was totally different. When events kick back off, and one day they're going to, a show floor can spell doom for complicated game names. And Google them as spelling, see what comes up when you do. Some of these things aren't going to be avoidable, but you need to know what you do about them. For example's sake, let's look at Necrobarista. Once they were misheard as Nico Barista. Suddenly, it's no longer a game about the dead being baristas, but instead a cute cafe-style cat cafe simulator. I'd play both, but the expectations have been set differently. Every game can be misheard, but you want to make sure you can reach your audience anyway and make your job easier wherever possible. If it's something that happens frequently, you might want to find a way around it too. For example, Vlambeer's ridiculous fishing was misspelt so often by users as ridiculous fishing that they now have that as a keyword in their search engine optimization to make sure they're not missing out on their audience finding them. If you don't think about their use cases and how your audience is looking for you, you're going to lose those people. So this is work you need to do. So, connotations. Connotations are super important. One of the best things you can do for yourself is make a word cloud of everything associated with your game that helps you identify where your game fits and where it differs, and might even help you find the name itself. If you pick specific feelings that you want to evoke and group the words with connotations underneath them, that can be really helpful too. If we have an open world exploration game with no combat, maybe calm, content, and curious is what we want the user to feel. But then we need to think about the other elements of our internal game that we have. Maybe we have a beautiful soundtrack, gorgeous visuals like flowing green grass and rivers. Quiet and still might not be the best picks to evoke the feelings that you want. If you're solving a mystery, maybe seek and search are perfect. Or maybe marvel and explore fits a sense of discovery rather than resolution. This can help you draw back into what exactly it is you're trying to say. Maybe solving that mystery is fulfilling, or maybe the environment is just relaxing and comforting. Consider cultural connotations as well, translations of specific words. The word gift means poison in German. A word that is harmless in one language could be offensive in another. You need to double, triple, and quadruple check these things before you get 6 months in and suddenly need to localize in French and realize that you're saying something kinda not okay. So, taglines. You have seen taglines before, almost every movie has one, and they're there to add additional context to a key message. We don't often consider the ones in games, but they're there. You can use this for your games or for your studio, and you might not use them externally. They're there to set tone. And think again about those connotations. Starcult, which is a studio in New Zealand, has the phrase, "We deal in feels," which I love. Deal has a connotation of handing out and giving something to someone. Feels, as in the spectrum of emotions. And it's also a little bit memey and silly. We deal in feels. You want to think about your core messaging. What's the core of what you want to do? And can it be defined in a single sentence? Maybe. Maybe this is going to only be for your team internally to keep them on track. But it's a good way to do some value planning and keep you accountable to what the game is about or what your studio is. So where should you use it? You can use this in your pitch decks, in your mailing signatures, in your key art, your headlines, or maybe you don't use it anywhere at all, and it's just for your team to know and be aware of. Now the elevator pitch. We've all heard about the elevator pitch and how important it is. Ideally, you want a game literate person to hear your elevator pitch and go, oh, so it's kind of like this game that you've identified as part of your target audience without you having to say it. If you can, you want to avoid mentioning the name of another game or specific genres in your elevator pitch. You want similarities but differences that make this game something new and worth finding out more about. Your elevator pitch is that little sentence on your Steam page before someone bothers to scroll down. You need enough there to capture attention that they'll bother wanting to find out more information. If you give away too much, you set an expectation too quickly. I feel like I don't like RPGs, but I love Undertale because it sold me on different things before it tried to sell me on the RPG, and I was already invested. It's a balancing act. You want to pique a listener's interest and have a balance of feeling and doing. So the game that I'm working on, Hola Vista, we could have easily gone with this elevator pitch. Everything in here is true. Hola Vista is a first-person puzzle adventure with lush environments with secrets to uncover. But if we break it down, we can put a billion other games in that spot and it'll be a pitch for them. The Witness, Firewatch, Myst, all say the same things and all are actually kind of correct. But they're not the same, and they give wildly different experiences. You don't want someone to be able to replace your game's name with another game and the pitch to still make sense. Victoria Tran from Kitfox Games gave a great talk about this some time ago that I really recommend you looking up, specifically around hooks. So we can see here when we update the pitches, they have things in common, but they're not the same. The witness talks about the mechanic, but notes that you'll be challenged and surprised. You know you'll feel isolated, that you're in a place of mystery. Even the name, The Witness, speaks to a sense of disconnect between you as an active presence in the world. Firewatch is a little more direct, using genre relations to set the scope. Single player, first person, but then immediately leads with the unique selling point of the game, your emotional connection to another person. Who are they? You can't see them, and this intensifies the mystery for the reader. If Myst released today, it would not sell as an indie. The art would have to be phenomenal to draw the user in due to the amount of releases on Steam. This elevator pitch doesn't tell us anything about the game. The only way this game sells easily is if the studio is already a known quantity or if it's the sequel to a beloved game. It tells us mystery and adventure, but if you saw this elevator pitch written in the wild, you wouldn't go looking for more information. So back to this pitch. What are we actually missing? So your elevator pitch should try and have some combination of emotional clarity. Nothing tells me about this pitch if the game is fast-paced or slow, if the secrets are good or bad. I don't know what emotional experience I'm going to have. We've seen a rise of wholesome games and similar, and people more than ever want to know what feelings they'll get from your game. We're also missing genre cohesion. First-person puzzle adventure is a lot of different kinds of games to slam together that set a lot of different expectations. Even if it's true, who's our actual core audience? Probably not first-person shooter players or first-person players, majority being on mobile. So do we need to lead with that? Do we need to reference genre at all? We're missing environment context. What kind of environment are we in? I don't know if I'm in a modern scenario, a super old scenario, a dungeon, or a city. And we're missing a unique selling point or a hook, something that helps us stand out compared to another game. We've already proven we can slot a lot of other games in here, so how do we differentiate one to hook a user? Here's how we fix it. So we've added some emotional clarity. Explore gives feelings of taking your time. By adding confront to secrets, there's no fight or defeat that hints at physical conflict, but confront encourages emotional conflict, and there clearly will be a point when these intersect. Elusive hints at an aloof nature for the company that's hired her, and a connection is encouraged between her architecture role and the mansion itself. You'll confess a personal or a negative connotation with online. We were worried about this. We thought people might assume there was a social media built into the game, but by adding as Carmen, we remove the user personally from this, and we clearly outline what they are and what they'll be doing: exploring, photographing, confronting secrets, confessing things. We've removed genre confusion entirely, so no one's going to see this and assume it's the kind of game for them off the bat because it's on a certain platform or of a certain genre. And we've given clear environment context: junior architect, new hire, Carmen. You might be thinking, but I don't know what your hook is. Well, one of the key components of our hook is our art and our gameplay mechanics, so this needs to go alongside it to encourage context. But we don't want people to turn off playing with it by it being a mobile game and immediately making assumptions. This is a challenge for a lot of devs, but a gifable game can be really helpful. We've invested heavily in trailers and gifs to help communicate the visual nature of the game and the fact that you'll be playing in these 360-degree environments, something we touch on in our later pitches. So when using any of these pitches, including the ones that I'm about to tell you about, you need to think about 3 questions. Talking to someone at a PAX is different to talking to someone online or at a bar or in an elevator or to press. So you're going to want to practice this out loud. It's the best gift you can give yourself, and you'll shift the way you say it every time to sound a little bit less wooden, but you want to hit the main points. But if your elevator pitch leans heavily on genre descriptors, you might lose your audience really quickly. Someone who plays match 3 isn't going to understand what roguelike means or its connotations. If it leans heavily on it's this game plus this game and your audience has lower awareness of the wider field and hasn't played one or either, you're either talking to the wrong audience or you've overshot the comparison and they don't have a bar to hold it against. You need to be able to say this sentence to someone who's never played a video game and have them interested, but also to someone who's played everything and does game reviews and have them be interested. You can always use these things once you get a better understanding of the person. If we get a sense of who we're talking to, that they're kind of aware of pop culture and games in general, sometimes we'll pull out it's like MTV Cribs meets Myst to add a little bit more of interest. So what else? Your narrative pitch. Your narrative pitch is there to convey the feelings of the experience in some way. When I say narrative though, I don't necessarily mean story. If your game is a player versus player shooter, there's a story there to the experience. It's high octane, it's high energy, it's intense, and your pitch needs to match it. You need to create an experience that alludes to the game's experience and the feelings it will give your players. So a lot of your key art will be trying to tell this story too. If we look here, Apex as a shooter has a sense of movement and motion, speed and energy. You have other teammates, you're on the move. It alludes to abilities working together. Zelda screams exploration, but dampens it with quiet and solidarity of just you there, choices and adventure. Anno is sprawling, smoggy, nature versus city and growth. And Dead Space is scientific, futuristic, but dark and mysterious. So Hades, for example, sets the same tone with its key art that it does its pitch. When you read the pitch, you immediately identify the feelings that it's trying to sell to you. A sense of immortality and myth, the underworld, feelings of power and death, strength and escape, gods. And the same things are being communicated in the key art. This is a story about strength, power, death, and there's elements of Greek mythology with the wreath that he's wearing. For Hola Vista, which contains a lot of narrative, we wanted to double down into the futurism themes and its encompassing social media, adding a couple of little extra hooks, which isn't mentioned in our initial pitch other than the word online. It brings further context for the user, explains why Carmen finds herself with this set task, and alludes to mystery even further. You're not given a task, you're charged with it. Your narrative pitch is your follow-up. You've given your elevator pitch, the audience is still interested, or maybe it's the second paragraph in an email you're sending. In person, you'd be tweaking this again, but you might use this as a slide for your pitch decks along with some art when you're explaining those feelings in a little more detail, or as a pull-out quote at the top of a website. But, of course, a lot of the time, people just want to know what the game is like to play, rather than the feelings it's going to give them to do so. This is where the gameplay pitch comes in. This isn't your elevator pitch for a reason. Your interested parties will go looking for this, because it's all about the gameplay matching the expectations and perceptions that we set earlier. This is often the hardest pitch and much easier to break out into dot points. If we had said Hola Vista was a first-person adventure and then people go to the gameplay pitch where they find out it's a mobile game, there's a chance that we've created a cognitive dissonance for our reader. We've created a disconnect between their image of the game and what the gameplay actually is. The gameplay pitch comes after the elevator and narrative and is often best known as the features section, but sometimes it's a paragraph. It's all about the tangible game experience. What is the user doing to interact with the world, and how does that impact the gameplay? The problem a lot of the time is that people don't realize what features matter to their specific audience in a gameplay pitch. If you're making a platformer, saying you have 1,000 levels could be a big selling point, but if you're making a platformer, you don't need to tell your audience things they expect from you. Let's take Hollow Knight, for example, and look at some of their specifically gameplay featured dot points. Here's how they could have written them. It'll be saying the same things as their exact page, but in a far less effective way. We expect to be able to fight, level up, defeat bosses, and equip things in a game like Hollow Knight. So how do we make the game stand out? We identify the ways in which we can elevate the expected. So, they add a lot of words with connotations, like tightly tuned, deadly, powerful, ethereal, fiery, ferocious, vanquished, twisted, bizarre, all of them having similar emotional reactions for a reader. They specify some of the mechanical abilities you can utilize with mechanical clarity. Dodge, dash, slash, leap, spells, strength, speed, blast. There's variety there and a number of different ways you could play. They're clear about the number of enemies and bosses a player will experience, communicating that not only is this a game that potentially has a progression path, but also lets you know that there are different relics and items to create a unique game experience, and sets an expectation of about how much content you should be engaging with. They add game-specific mentions without fully explaining them to further interest the listener or the reader, like Soul, capitalized, and Hunter's Journal. All of these things help add hooks and create rules that better align the user's expectations. If a user reads the left and plays Hollow Knight, they'd be pleasantly surprised. But if they don't see the images or fully understand the context of the pitch, they're not going to get to the point of playing it because it doesn't give the game a brand. Whereas if they read the right, they've had their interest piqued, they buy the game, their expectations are matched, and from there you've become not only a known quantity, but a trusted quantity, encouraging them to support you in your future games. Different audiences might need a different pitch, but you can't divert too far from the actual value proposition of your game. You need to know where you can tweak it to say what you need. Sometimes it's a word or two, sometimes it's how you phrase things. So our audience has been identified as people who enjoy puzzle and narrative experiences, choices matter games. I won't bore you with the whole breakdown, but it helped us know what we're trying to actually tell them. We want them to know there's story, yes, but that there's no combat. We want them to clearly identify this as a game with elements of exploration and solving, mystery and resolution, and we want to connect our internal idea of what the game is with the external perception. So we ended up with this gameplay pitch. So, when do you use it? You might not send this to someone as high priority in media, but maybe it's really important to an influencer who plays a lot of these kind of games to get them an idea of how they're going to play it, or even if it's single player or multi. Your gameplay pitch could be in its own space in your pitch deck, further building on your branding. So how does it all fit together when we give the full pitch in person or over a few slides or web pages? So Overwatch is a great example of using this systematic approach, right? You get a tagline and an elevator pitch on the homepage, and there's no mention of genre. You hit about, and you get the gameplay pitch. And finally, you get the genre and the 3 specific gameplay things you'll do: travel the world, build a team, contest objectives. People tend to consider certain genres as not for them off the bat, and you don't want people dismissing your game because the first thing they heard was team-based shooter. Finally, scrolling down gives you a narrative pitch, a cast of heroes, those ones that the world needs, and 3 uniquely different hero styles to appeal to different feelings and players. Maybe you want to be a freedom fighter or a moon ape or a battlefield DJ. What about a Steam store page? Here's one of my favorite examples with Bubba Is You. In the yellow, we see our elevator pitch, award-winning to establish higher trust, but wouldn't have been in at launch, puzzle to signal their target audience, but then the entire rest of the sentence is built to intrigue with their hook. You change the rules by playing. In green, we see the narrative pitch. The story of the game experience is explained. Manipulate with connotations of having a deliberate effect, giving a sense of control. Surprising and unexpected, speaking to a sense of exploration and delight. Those are the feelings they want to sell. Then in the purple is the gameplay pitch. It goes into more detail on the mechanics, the potential outcomes of those mechanics, and strengthens that concept that they set at the start of being in control of not only the puzzle, but the goal with the final sentence. It doesn't always look this clean, and these aren't perfect rules. Different pages do different things to break this down, and it's not always in a specific order. Moonlighter, for example, starts with selling the feelings because that is part of the hook of their game. Maybe that needs to be explained first on a page. Sometimes they rely heavily on gifs and art to accompany short sentences to explain the features, but it's the same rules of connotations and clarity that they're using. The more you look at different games, and this one is Satisfactory that's shown here, the more you'll be able to pick out the different ways in which this approach helps set expectations, create the perception for your audience of what your game is, and align that with the reality. It also will help you sit down and actually do this process and figure out what you're trying to tell your audience about, rather than just listing everything that you've got in your game. So our full Hola Vista pitch ends up being this. So this is on our website, on our About page. This is in the initial pages of your press kit maybe. First thing people see when they scroll down on the main store page. High-level overview of the 3 main things comprising your game: hook, narrative, gameplay. So what now? If you take the time to sit down and create this brand book, you'll have an understanding of your game as a whole and what it offers to your audience. If you're trying to do this process and you're like, whoa, this is way too difficult, it's likely because you don't know who your audience actually is. If your design is all over the place trying to appeal to different things and you don't have these core pillars both on your brand of your game and the design itself, you can have a really tricky time selling it. You can't communicate to an audience that you don't understand, and you can't sell feelings or an experience that isn't there, and you especially can't match those feelings to a totally different experience that you've tried to sell. Make sure you're constantly reviewing and refreshing this plan and these pitches. So, know what your audience expects from the genre terms that you decide to throw out, and make sure that that's what you're trying to sell. Know when to subvert these expectations and when to confirm them. Sometimes the subversion of an expectation of a genre is the hook. Undertale was so popular because it was a non-violent RPG, and that was really different to the sort of RPGs that were around. But that space as well is becoming more saturated. And that's where research comes in really handy. Align your internal understanding of the game with the external. Make sure your team knows these things and understands the building blocks of branding the game and the studio, because they're representing you too. Remember to experiment and test your theories on your audience and of what's valuable in playtesting and communications and wherever you can. Look, there are no guidelines to make this process perfect, and there's no rules. These are just concepts and ways that you can approach it. You can do whatever you want so long as it achieves the same functions. But if you're struggling, a brand book can be a really, really good place to start. Thank you for that. I know it was lightning fast and there was a lot in there. This was actually based off an article that I wrote that you can go and look up and read in a little bit more detail. It's about a 20-minute read, but this has a little bit of extra things that I threw in just for you since I've had some time to sit with it. I hope it was helpful. Please feel free to send me an email. I hope I've been answering lots of questions in the chat. And thank you so much for spending half an hour with me to listen to me talk about branding. Have a wonderful day and enjoy the rest of the event. Bye.